What in the ever-loving shit am I looking at right now?
What? I don't see.
What the fuck?
Wait, what the fuck?
Hey,
Are you
there's
okay?
something. What the fuck? Maroon? Like,
In 2008, a teenager was hiking through a dense forest in Northern California when he decided to stop and set up camp for the night. He walked a few hundred feet off the main trail into the forest and found a small clearing. After setting up his tent, he climbed inside and went to sleep. A few hours later, he woke up, hearing something outside his tent. Since his tent didn't have any windows and it was completely dark outside, he couldn't see anything. He lay there, listening carefully, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when he heard it again. This is a story of a teenage hiker that still remains a mystery. So let's dive into the story. In 2007, the movie Into the Wild was released, becoming an instant cult classic. It was based on the true story of a young man named Christopher McCandless. In 1990, Christopher graduated with honors and had the chance to get a great job, but instead, he chose a different path. Wanting true freedom, he gave away all his belongings and money and headed to Alaska to live off the grid by himself. He eventually found an old rusted bus in the wilderness, where he lived for 113 days before tragically dying of starvation. While his story is sad, the movie highlighted his adventurous spirit and his pursuit of freedom. By the end, viewers felt inspired rather than sad, motivated to take risks and seek adventure. One person deeply inspired by Christopher's story was 18-year-old Matt Higgins from Oregon. Matt was about to graduate from high school and had no idea what to do next. But after watching Into the Wild, he saw a new possibility, heading off into the wilderness, just like Christopher did, though not permanently. Matt loved the idea, seeing it as a break from reality where he could find himself before figuring out his next steps. So he came up with a plan. After graduating in 2007, he would spend the spring of 2008 hiking the California section of the Pacific Crest Trail, all by himself. The section Matt planned to hike was about 1,700 miles long, starting at the Mexican border and stretching north to Oregon. The trail passed through deserts, mountains, and areas with dangerous wildlife. Some parts of the trail were very remote, meaning if something went wrong, hikers would be completely on their own. This wasn't a hike for beginners, but Matt wasn't new to the outdoors. He had hiked and camped all over Oregon and the western U.S., from safe, well-marked trails to more dangerous areas with cougars, bears, and cliffs. Matt felt confident that he was prepared for this adventure. In many ways, he was right, but something was about to happen on the trail that even his experience couldn't prepare him for. Matt graduated from high school in 2007, and in 2008, he stuck to his plan. That spring, he packed his stuff, headed to the airport, and flew to Southern California. Once he landed, he made his way down to the Mexican border, where he started his journey on the Pacific Crest Trail, hiking north. For the first few weeks, Matt hiked as far as he could each day. When it got too dark or when he was too tired, he'd set up his campsite right by the trail. After eating a quick meal, he'd crawl into his tent and sleep, only to wake up early the next morning and do it all over again. His main struggles during this time were dealing with exhaustion, getting a little dehydrated, and almost stepping on a rattlesnake. Other than that, the hike had been fairly smooth for him. But when he reached Lassen National Forest, a dense forest in Northern California about 150 miles from Oregon, things started to change. Shortly after entering Lassen, Mark was walking on a winding dirt path surrounded by trees that were so close together it felt like walls rising up around him. The air was quiet and dark, but peaceful, with birds chirping and insects buzzing. Matt was taking his time, enjoying the calm. Then, the trail took a sharp turn to the right, and what he saw stopped him in his tracks. About 20 feet away, sitting on a big boulder, were two middle-aged people, a man and a woman. They were both dressed in all white, looking dirty and unkempt. The man had a big scruffy beard, and both of them were staring directly at Matt. Feeling awkward, Matt quickly looked down and kept walking toward them. As he got closer, he forced a smile and waved, saying, "Hi," but they didn't respond. They just stared at him without saying a word or showing any emotion. After walking past them, Matt felt uneasy, knowing they were still watching him. As he kept going, Matt resisted the urge to look back, feeling uncomfortable from their intense stares. He wondered, why didn't they at least wave or say something? Since it was rare to see other hikers on the Pacific Crest Trail, especially after days without seeing one, it felt odd that they didn't acknowledge him. Still, Matt brushed it off, telling himself, maybe they didn't understand me or had their own issues. Who knows? It's not my problem. He kept moving forward and never looked back at the two people in white. Later that day, as the sun was setting, Matt was still walking through the thick forest. The light was fading, and it was getting hard to see. He started looking for a place to camp, but with how close the trees were to the trail, there wasn't any room to set up without blocking the path. Not wanting to be in the way, Matt walked about 300 feet into the trees and found a small clearing to set up his tent. Once his camp was ready, he cooked some food, packed up his leftovers in a waterproof bag, and hung it from a tree branch to keep it safe from bears. It was pitch black by the time he climbed into his tent, zipped it up, and got into his sleeping bag to fall asleep. The next morning, Matt woke up just as the sun was starting to rise. It was still pretty dark, but there was a little light. He unzipped his tent and looked outside, immediately noticing that the bag of food he had hung in the tree was missing. Matt stepped out of his tent thinking maybe it fell to the ground, but it was nowhere to be found. The bag was just gone. He thought to himself, I didn't hear anything last night, so maybe a bear came into the campsite, found food, and ran off with it. Matt walked over to the tree where the food had been, looking for bear prints to confirm his theory. But as he looked around, there were no bear prints. Instead, he saw 2 sets of human boot prints that didn't belong to him. Before he could process that, he realized that these prints weren't just near the tree where his food was, they were everywhere, around his tent and all over his campsite. As Matt looked at the trail of human prints, he started to think, how did this happen? I went to bed when it was pitch black, and I woke up just as the sun was rising. These people walked all over my campsite, cut down my food, and somehow did it silently, without waking me up. How is that even possible? After going through these thoughts, Matt realized the only explanation was that the 2 people he saw earlier, the ones dressed in white, had followed him. They must have waited for him to fall asleep and then snuck into his campsite to steal his food. As he thought about it, he began to wonder if they were still nearby, watching him. He quickly looked around, almost expecting to see them behind a tree, but he didn't spot anyone. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Feeling uneasy, Matt packed up his campsite as quickly as he could and started heading toward the trail. He kept thinking, they're going to jump out from behind a tree or grab me from behind, so he moved faster and faster. When he finally reached the trail, he looked up and down but didn't see anyone. He took a deep breath, calmed down, and started walking north. Matt walked for hours, occasionally glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see the man and woman in white, but they never appeared. Eventually, the dense forest opened up to a big open field, and the sun was high in the sky. As he walked through the open area, he started feeling more relaxed. The sunlight and the open space eased his nerves, and despite the creepy encounter, Matt told himself that maybe those people were just hungry and needed the food more than he did. Let them have it, he thought. It's not worth worrying about. Matt convinced himself that he wouldn't run into the people in white again, but he was wrong. Over the next 3 days, as he continued walking through the Lassen forest, he didn't see them, and nothing was stolen. It seemed like they had taken what they wanted and moved on. But on the 4th day, things got strange again. That night, Matt had to leave the trail to find a clearing for his tent in a densely wooded area. He walked a few hundred feet off the trail, set up his tent, and created a perimeter of sticks around his campsite. This was a precaution he started after the food incident. The idea was that if an animal or person came too close to his campsite, they would step on the sticks and wake him up. After getting everything set up, Matt ate a quick meal, stored his food, and climbed into his tent for the night. A few hours later, Matt suddenly woke up. He opened his eyes, but it was completely dark in his tent. There were no windows, and outside was pitch black, so even with his eyes open, he couldn't see anything. Lying there in total darkness, he listened closely, unsure why he had woken up, whether something had startled him or if it was just random. As he listened, he heard a stick snap outside his tent. His heart raced. He knew something, an animal or a person, was only a few feet away. Quietly, he pulled his arm out of his sleeping bag and reached for his hunting knife. Just as he gripped the handle, he heard more footsteps. Whatever it was hadn't stopped and didn't seem to care about the noise it was making. It was still moving toward his tent. Matt started to panic. It could be an animal, but just a couple of days earlier, 2 people had been in his campsite stealing his food. He lay there, ready to defend himself if anyone got too close. In the middle of nowhere, he knew that if someone was out there, they weren't a friend. He shook with fear, listening intently as the footsteps got closer until they stopped right next to his head, just a foot away. He couldn't see anything, but just kept listening. Then he heard whispering, but it wasn't coming from right outside. It seemed to be coming from all around the forest. Confused and scared, Matt lay frozen. He had the knife, but felt too terrified to use it. Suddenly, everything stopped. The whispering and footsteps went silent. It was a relief, but he wished he could hear footsteps retreating into the woods. Instead, it was just silence, as if whoever was out there was still waiting. In the dark, he couldn't even peek outside to see if there was a person or many standing there. Finally, morning came. Matt still hadn't heard any footsteps leaving. Once the sun was fully up and light came through his tent, he knew he had to look outside. He quickly unzipped the flap and peeked out, finding no one there. Knife in hand, he stepped outside, ready for a confrontation, but there was no one around. Instead of feeling relieved, he wondered if someone was hiding behind the trees. For a few minutes, he searched the campsite, expecting to see those people again, but found nothing. Then he started questioning himself. Was that just a nightmare? Did it really happen? But when he looked down, he saw clear boot prints all over his campsite, including a trail circling his tent. This nightmare had become real for Matt. He quickly packed up his things, slung them over his shoulder, and ran back toward the trail. Once he reached the trail, he headed north, glancing over his shoulder the whole way. He kept telling himself, I just need to get out of Lassen National Forest. I need to escape the people in white. If I can leave this place, I'll be safe. That thought pushed him to move as fast as he could all day. By the afternoon, he finally made it out of Lassen and into a nearby town. That night, he camped close to civilization, wanting to feel secure. As he lay in his tent that night, he reflected on the events of the last few days. He was almost certain that the people in white he'd seen on the boulder were behind the strange things happening at night. It made sense that they had stolen his food, but the second incident from the night before left him puzzled. If the people in white had been following him all this time, how hadn't he noticed? He had been looking over his shoulder constantly, yet they managed to track him to this unmarked campsite deep in the woods. How did they do that? And when they were at his campsite, whispering to each other, what were they up to? Why did their footsteps and whispers suddenly stop without a sound as they left? Matt kept replaying these questions in his mind until he finally fell asleep. The next morning, he woke up thinking about the people in white and what they wanted. As he packed up his campsite, he considered calling his family to pick him up and leaving. But this hike meant a lot to him, and he was only about 100 miles from finishing. After hiking over 1,600 miles, he didn't want to quit now. So he packed up his things, threw them over his shoulder, and continued on. That day, Matt left the small town and headed into another dense forest called Mount Shasta. This forest was similar to Lassen, but had a chilling reputation. Many people go missing there under strange circumstances. Some of the most unsettling stories come from survivors who claim they were with someone, turned away for just a moment, and when they looked back, that person had vanished without a trace, never to be found despite extensive searches. The number of mysterious disappearances in Mount Shasta is alarming. With that in mind, Matt entered Mount Shasta Forest. Even though the dense trees made him anxious, he pushed through, reminding himself to focus on finishing his hike. For the first 3 days, he kept his head down, hiking as far as he could each day. He set up camp close to the trail each night, and didn't have any encounters with the people in white or anyone else. He felt completely alone. But on the 4th day, everything changed. Instead of being surrounded by dense trees, Matt found himself on a wide trail up the side of a mountain, where the visibility was much better. He enjoyed the beautiful day as he walked, but when he turned around, he spotted 2 small white dots far back on the trail. It was the people in white. They were back. At this point, Matt was over 50 miles away from where he had first seen the people in white sitting on a boulder. This confirmed 2 things. First, he was right. They really had followed him. And second, they were still trailing him for some unknown reason. Suddenly, Matt lost all interest in finishing his hike. He just wanted to escape those people. He quickly pulled out his map and was shocked to see he was in one of the most isolated areas of the hike, at least 25 miles from the nearest town, Castella, California. With no better options, he put the map away, took one last look at the approaching people in white, and sprinted down the trail. He ran for hours, not even stopping when he couldn't see them anymore. As night fell and the trail grew dim, he kept going. It wasn't until it was so dark and he couldn't see the ground anymore that he finally stopped, completely exhausted. He then left the trail and walked deep into the forest, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and those people. Eventually, he found a clearing far from the trail. He set up his tent right in the center and carefully arranged a perimeter of sticks around his campsite to create a barrier. After zipping himself inside and keeping all his gear close in case he needed to leave quickly, he crawled into his sleeping bag. Lying there, he didn't expect to sleep. He was terrified. He reassured himself that he had run several miles ahead of them and figured they wouldn't know where he had set up camp. As he started to doze off, he suddenly heard the sounds of sticks breaking around his campsite. That familiar whispering filled the air, and then, before he could react, his tent lit up as if someone was shining a light on him. Someone had found him, sneaking up on his secluded campsite. The light turned off, and silence followed. Matt's instincts kicked in. He jumped out of his sleeping bag, burst outside, and began shouting and waving his knife, hoping to scare them away. Just then, he heard a stick snap right behind him. He turned to see a dark figure running towards him, but without thinking, he bolted away from the campsite. It was pitch black in the forest, with trees surrounding Matt everywhere. He was running fast, crashing into branches and falling to the ground, fueled by adrenaline as he tried to escape from someone he believed that was chasing him. After about 5 minutes of sprinting, he stumbled and fell at the base of a fallen tree. This tree had landed in a way that created a small gap underneath it, so Matt quickly slid underneath the log, positioning himself to see back the way he'd come. As he lay there, he spotted a light in the distance. People were searching for him in the forest. He watched in fear as the group with the light got closer, but they walked right past him without noticing. Matt stayed hidden under the log all night, terrified, even as the sun came up. He remained there for several hours until early afternoon, finally deciding to crawl out and look around. He didn't see anyone nearby, but instead of going back to his campsite to grab his gear, he decided to leave everything behind. He was too scared that the people in white might be around, so he took off running again, heading back to the trail. Once he reached the trail, he ran all the way to Castella, California. There, he hitchhiked to Mount Shasta, where he reported his experience to the police and forestry service. They took his information and put him up in a motel for the night. The next day, he contacted his family, who drove from Oregon to pick him up and take him home. Months later, Matt followed up with the Mount Shasta police and the Forest Service to see if they had learned anything about the people in white. The police told him that others had come forward reporting stolen items from their campsites in Mount Shasta and Lassen Forest, but Matt was the only one who mentioned being chased by the mysterious people. To this day, he has no idea who they were or what they wanted beyond the food they took. They somehow tracked him for nearly 100 miles, finding his campsites that were far off the main trail, all in complete darkness. It remains a mystery of how they managed to do it without alerting him. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please give a thumbs up and subscribe for more.